Copper Sun by Sharon Draper, Chapter 28, Punishment. Not since the day her mother died had Polly felt such agony. She gasped in disbelief, unable to catch her breath. Head spinning, she clung to Amari, who was choking on her sobs. Mrs. Derby threw herself onto her child, then fainted, this time for real. Mr. Derby dropped the gun, then looked at his hands. He seemed stunned. He turned to Clay and said quietly, "Go tell old Jubal to get up here and take care of all this." He would not look at the bodies. "And make sure Sarah Jane gets punished," he added without emotion. Polly watched Clay disappear into the darkness with a look of satisfaction on his face. Dr. Hoskins peered out of the door then, unsure of what he might encounter. "Come get my wife, Doctor," Mr. Derby called. "I believe she's fainted again. Unfortunately, she had to witness the disciplining of some unruly slaves, and it proved a bit much for her. See to her, will you, old fellow?" Mr. Derby took a deep breath and smoothed his doublet. The doctor crept slowly to the bloody scene, observed it all, but made no comment. He picked up Mrs. Derby in his arms and carried her back to the house. Lena waited at the door to assist him, her eyes bright with fear. Then Mr. Derby turned his attention to Teeny, Polly, and Amari, who huddled together. "Follow me," he said curtly. He led them down the familiar path to Teeny's kitchen, where he stopped. "Where is the boy, Tidbit?" he asked Teeny. She hesitated. "I don't rightly know, sir. He done all heard the noise, and I'd guess it scared him. Maybe he run off to the woods." "Call to him. You better hope he answers." Polly could see that Teeny was not sure what to do. "Tidbit," Teeny whispered softly. "Call him so he hears you," Mr. Derby demanded. "Tidbit, honey, you in there?" she called. Teeny called, her voice quavering. A faint rustling could be heard coming from the kindling box. Mr. Derby marched over, tossed aside the small pieces of firewood, and pulled out the boy out of the box by one arm. The dog growled softly. "Mama?" Tidbit called out. When Mr. Derby dropped the boy to the ground, Tidbit ran quickly to the skirts of his mother. She picked him up and held him close to her body. Mr. Derby spoke then. Polly sensed he was just barely in control of himself. "Follow me," he demanded once more, and he led them a few paces from the kitchen to the smokehouse. He pulled out a key, unlocked the door, and turned to look at the frightened group in front of him. "You," he said, pointing at Polly, "are a liar. I will not have such a person in my household." Polly cowered before him, her hands held up in front of her face. "Have mercy, sir," she whispered. He ignored her. "And you," he said to Amari with consternation, "have been trouble since I was kind enough to bring you here." Amari looked frightened, Polly thought, but furious at him as well. That gave Polly courage to stand a little straighter in spite of Mr. Derby's fury. "And you," he said fiercely to Teeny, "I trusted to obey me. Your responsibility was to me, and you failed." "I'm so sorry, sir," Teeny mumbled. "Too late," he said harshly. He thought for a moment. When Dr. Hoskins leaves in the morning, he will have 3 passengers. I will send Clay with him to make sure there are no more problems. If it were not for my son, I might never have discovered the whole truth." Polly searched for the words that might calm him down or change his mind. "Sir," she began, but Mr. Derby ignored her as he firmly pushed each of them into the dark, windowless smokehouse. Polly, Amari, and Teeny looked at one another, but did not fight him or object. They did not want to do anything to further incur his anger. Mr. Derby slowly closed the door, then opened it again. "Tomorrow is a market day in Charlestown," he said. "Polly, I plan to sell your indenture to a whorehouse in New Orleans. You'll bring a pretty penny. They like them young down there." He uttered a short laugh, harsh laugh. Tears welled up in Polly's eyes, but she shook her head and refused to cry. Anger began to replace her misery as she looked at Mr. Derby with steely-eyed fury. "And Mina, I could find another toy for my son to play with. I'm sure I can get more than I paid for you. A broken-in African is highly sought after." Amari looked devastated, but she too seemed to have run out of tears. She faced Mr. Derby with quiet resolve. The 2 girls stood there, stony and silent. "You'll leave at first light." They heard the lock fasten firmly in the latch and his footsteps as he headed back toward the house. "What about me, sir?" Teeny called through one of the wooden slats of the smokehouse. "Who gonna cook your food if you sells me?" The sound of the boots stopped. "Oh, Teeny," he called back, "I'd never sell you." You're much too valuable. Teeny breathed a small sigh of relief. She clung to Tidbit fiercely in the darkness. Oh, thank you, sir, she whispered. I'm selling Tidbit instead, Mr. Derby's voice said clearly. The sound of his boots on the hard dirt disappeared as he headed back to the big house. Teeny's wails echoed in the darkness.